Okay, so let's now look at topic 6.2, global energy consumption, and we're going to reference a lot of the things that we talked about in topic 6.1. Our objective today is to be able to describe the trends in energy consumption, both in developed and developing countries, and then globally. Again, remember that we are talking about both renewable and non-renewable sources, and then we're looking toward shifts in energy use as we move towards sustainability. We do not have any explicit vocabulary for this section because it's going to kind of be tied into things that we talk about along the way. Okay, so let's first look at how energy use and how it differs between both developed and developing countries. And so you can see that they're showing the dots in terms of population and then also, their energy use. So energy use in tons of oil equivalent per capita. Remember, we've talked about per capita before. That means per person. So when we look at this, we can see that the United States is really up there. Both Canada and the United States are really high in terms of energy use, tons of oil per person. The United States is about 7. Canada is a little bit above that, and that has to do with their heating cost. So pretty high in our energy consumption. And then we, can look at other countries. And so we talk a lot about China and about India, but if we look at their per person energy use, it's actually pretty low. The world average is just under 2, and that kind of cuts right between China and India, again, because we're talking about most of the world's population there. So this is per person. The United States uses far more energy than the average person from China or from India, Brazil, Turkey, any of those. So we're seeing both the number of people and the overall, where they fall. Okay, and this also we look at GDP per capita, which means the individual wealth per person. And we can see the United States is one of the wealthier countries, and so it makes sense that if we're one of the wealthier countries, we're also going to be using the most oil because consumption plays a big role. Okay, so if we look here, we can look at energy per person, again, and we can look at these trends since 1990. The world average is just under 2 tons of oil per person, per capita. An OECD has to do with a developed country, an economically developed country, and so that average is above 4, but we saw for the United States, it's closer to 7. And then a non-developed country is going to be closer to 1. And so we can see that although there are lots of people who live in non-developed countries, the number of people who are living in a developed country makes that much higher. Okay, so how does energy use differ between developed and developing countries? I just want you to see a picture of this because when I saw this, it really struck home for me. This is annual kilowatt hours per person. And so kilowatt hours is just a way that we measure energy consumption. Your refrigerator, on average, uses 450 kilowatts per kilowatt hours of energy. The average person in Ghana uses 300. Kenya, 156. Liberia, 79. Ethiopia, 52. So when we look at this, your refrigerator alone is using much, much more energy than the entire consumption of energy of a person in, say, Ethiopia or Tanzania. So how does energy use differ between developed and developing countries? Developed countries use the most energy, and the source that we use for energy is going to be non-renewable sources. On the flip side, a person living in a developing country is going to use much less energy, and that energy source is probably going to be a renewable energy source like biomass or using wood to light. So developed countries use more energy per capita per person and rely more on fossil fuels or non-renewable energy, whereas developing countries use much less energy per person and rely more on those renewable energy sources, often biomass. They are also investing more in renewable energy, like solar energy, wind energy, water energy as a country. When we look at those global trends, they're spending more money as a country in developing those energy sources in a least developed country. Okay, so development crisis. As a developing country or a country in the demographic transition, piece of stage 2 transitioning, as they become more economically developed, they're going to increase their resource consumption to be more like a developed country. And the more resources we consume, the more goods and services we consume, the more energy has to be used in order to develop those goods and services. And so when we look at, for example, this is annual electricity generation in China, we can see that, currently they are using 72% of their energy is coming from coal, and it's expected in the next, by 2040, that'll still be almost 50% of their energy coming from coal. So as China continues to develop, they're going to still be they're going to shift toward probably more and more fossil fuel reliance. And so that leads us to some issues. Because we're going to run out of those resources. And so China and some other countries are doing a pretty good job of trying to increase their development of other energy sources. For China, that's hydropower. And we're going to talk about the good and the bad of that as we go through this lecture in future topics. But if a developing country moves toward becoming economically developed, they're going to increase the resource consumption, which increases their energy consumption. Okay, and so we've kind of looked at this already before, but I want us to again focus on the fact that this dark blue section is the energy that's getting from traditional biomass or plant matter. And as a country becomes more developed, they're going to use less and less of this, less and less renewable, and typically they end up using more petroleum, coal, and natural gas. And that's our concern because fossil fuels and nuclear energy are both non-renewable energy sources. So you can use this to kind of answer the most widely used energy sources. We know that it's petroleum, coal, and natural gas taking up about 78% of our energy supplies. Nuclear takes up about 3%, and renewable takes up 19%. If we break that down, 9% of overall energy is coming from traditional biomass, and that's often not a sustainable level. Okay, so what are some methods that humans can use to reduce the consumption of energy sources? The biggest thing is conserving energy, and there's kind of 3 pieces to that. The biggest part is to improve efficiency. So a lot of our systems that we use are incredibly wasteful. So the old school light bulb, the Edison light bulb, or what's called an incandescent light bulb, those only have about a 4 to 5% efficiency. That means that when you put in, let's say, $100 to that light bulb, 95 of the dollars just makes the light bulb hot. The other 5 actually lights up the room. So it only has a 5% efficiency. Well, that means we're wasting 95% of the energy. So improving efficiency and switching to, say, a compact fluorescent or an LED light source is going to use much less energy, much better in terms of shifting towards sustainability. So the very first thing is improving efficiency. The second thing that we can do is that we can conserve what we do use. So for example, turning off lights when leaving a room, changing your thermostat so that it's not quite as cool during the summer or not as warm during the winter, architectural design of buildings, not wasting food, not wasting hot water, not wasting electricity as we're washing things and taking care of things in our home. By turning off things that we're not using, we're going to conserve energy and therefore use less of it. And lastly, we kind of briefly talked about that in the other 2, but reducing consumption and waste of goods. The fewer things you buy, the fewer things have to be mined or transported, processed, all of that within industry, and so we use less energy overall. So reducing our consumption of goods and services also reduces our consumption of energy. And so those are large-scale things that can be done. Okay, so here's just a kind of overall thing within your home that you can do to conserve electricity. And so it talks about using LED lights, improving insulation, using compact fluorescent bulbs, using a thermostat at your house in order to, keep heating and cooling costs down, making sure that your windows don't have leaks in them because you're just wasting energy in heating and cooling. Using motion sensors, switches, and timers for lights. Lots of places do this, just not in the U.S. But a lot of our classrooms have that, where you'll walk in and the light will come on and then it'll shut off after a certain point in time. So you don't have to remember to turn the light on and off. Making sure, again, that doors and windows are sealed well so you don't have cracks, allowing heated air or cooled air. Replacing old appliances with Energy Star appliances because they have a better efficiency. Those are all just things that are simple things that can be done at home to conserve electricity. Not only is that better globally, it's just better for you personally because it saves you money. Okay, text connection. You're going to look at 15.2. Which covers pages 456 to 464. You're going to read over that. And again, you're just kind of skimming right now because I'm going to have you go back to that in several topics and look at it again. But I want you to kind of skim over it, add to anything that you think you can add to your workbook. And then when you get to those checkpoint for understanding questions, you need to pull out the sheet from the other day, go to chapter 15, and you're going to answer 15.2 questions. Okay, once you have done that, then you're going to do the global energy consumption activity. There's an article in the link that's here. Again, remember, you have the links to the PowerPoint so you can actually physically click on the link. And you're going to read over the article, and then you get the entire page for this. You're going to divide your page into 6 boxes. 5 of the boxes, you're going to summarize each of the 5 mistakes that it talks about in global energy growth. And then in the last box, you're going to summarize the main idea of the article. Within each of these boxes, I want you to include one small illustration. But you're just going to kind of look at the overall mistakes we are making in the fight against global energy poverty. Okay, so let's take a second. Let's go back. Let's make sure we've hit our objective. Do we understand the trends in energy consumption? Do we see how those things have changed over time? Do we see how they change between a developed and a developing country? And do we understand the future projection of energy growth? Those are things that hopefully you can answer. Again, once you have finished all of this, I want you to meet with your Unit 6 group, and I want you to talk through what do you understand, what are you not familiar with, what stood out to you in the reading, and kind of compare your answers or what you came up with for your activity page. All right, this concludes 6.2.